The Roaring Twenties, Prohibition, and a Nation of Compromised Morals.
The 18th Amendment, also known as Prohibition, was passed in 1919 and banned the sale, manufacturing, and transportation of alcoholic beverages in the United States. This amendment quickly became an unpopular law, creating conflict throughout the nation, eventually turning the United States into a nation of compromised morals, full of organized crime and everyday lawbreakers.
The Industrial Age brought about change to the United States. Immigrants flooded into ports from all over the world. In the East, they came from Europe, and in the West, they came from Asia. Many feared the new influx of immigrants would change the morality of the nation. They didn't speak English and had customs that seemed strange to many Americans. Some of the customs included drinking alcohol, and some did so to excess. Another change happened to the American family life. In the average American family life stabilized at this time, but new behaviors came about. Men resumed their role as leaders of the house, and women were forced to uphold the sanctity of the family life. Men had little restrictions on them, and for many, that meant they drank alcohol heavily. This was not seen as a moral compromise, but rather business as usual. In some cases, women blamed alcohol when their husbands left or were abusive. Alcohol began to be seen as a villain. For this reason, women became the leaders in what would be called the United States temperance movement. Groups trying to stop this moral decline of the nation formed all over the United States. For example, in Ohio on May 24, 1893, temperance advocates formed the Ohio Anti-Saloon League in Oberlin. As people moved from rural areas to urbanized ones, many people in the United States believed that they were losing touch with their religious values, believing that one way that people were violating God's desires was by consuming alcohol. The Ohio Anti-Saloon League hoped to prohibit alcohol by enforcing existing laws and by implementing new ones. This same year, temperance supporters in Washington, D.C. formed their own Anti-Saloon League. In 1895, the Ohio and Washington organizations united to create the National Anti-Saloon League, which eventually became the Anti-Saloon League of America. The Anti-Saloon League adopted prohibition as its primary goal. All of these groups lobbied Washington for years. By the time the 20th century rolled in, these types of temperance societies had become prevalent. Other organizations, such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union, built up their movement through education. For example, they would persuade people to believe that alcoholism will be the reason that God won't bless America anymore. The Women's Christian Temperance Union also built up their movement through local and state laws. On December 18, 1917, an amendment to ban alcohol was proposed to the Senate. By January 16, 1919, this amendment, which was the 18th Amendment, was ratified. Later, in October of 1919, Congress passed the Volstead Act. This act allowed the legislation to set down rules to enforce the ban on alcohol. This was also known as the National Prohibition Act. This ban was alternatively known as the Noble Experiment, because it was an experiment to bring families together. This name was dubbed so by President Herbert Hoover, who wrote to an Idaho senator in 1928 saying, "Our country has deliberately undertaken a great social and economic experiment, noble in motive and far-reaching in purpose."
The main question that has existed for years is, was this experiment truly noble? Most people say it was not. An amendment that was meant to stop the moral decline of a nation actually made it worse. In fact, most Americans were against it. John D. Rockefeller is quoted as saying, "I earnestly hoped that it would be generally supported by public opinion. This has not been the result, but rather that drinking generally has increased." He spoke of how the ban simply changed how people got their liquor. Even worse, as a result of the ban, organized crime popped up throughout America, turning crime into a business. And the main business was the illegal production of alcohol, also known as bootlegging. Al Capone was one of the most notorious of these bootleggers. He began organized crime families, or Italian mafia families, in Chicago during the 1920s. During his reign as leader of the Chicago Italian Mafia, he made about $60 million and was responsible for the infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The massacre was when 7 of Al Capone's rivals were found dead in Chicago on February 14, 1929. The thing was, he never went to jail for these crimes. Instead, he went to jail for tax evasion and served 11 years. Unfortunately, not only were there people who made a lifelong crime out of alcohol, but enterprising individual bootleggers produced millions of gallons of rock-gut moonshine. This had a very foul taste. Those who were desperate enough to drink it took the risk of being struck blind or even being poisoned. This was known as tainted liquor. Also, wine for sacramental purposes was allowed. Therefore, many fake rabbis and priests started to sell alcohol. Drugstores were also allowed to sell medicinal whiskey. This pharmaceutical booze often came with seemingly laughable doctor's orders, like, take 3 ounces every hour for stimulant until stimulated. So now patients were able to buy a pint of liquor every 10 days. Although a few businesses closed down, many still needed to be in business, so those breweries and winemakers still had to make money. Some companies, like Yoni and Anheuser-Busch, put alcohol into ice cream. This created what we now have, rum ice cream. Some other companies produced a legal brew called near beer. This contained less than 0.5% alcohol. Lastly, there were the secret bars, also known as speakeasies. These were in the backs of restaurants owned by otherwise moral people. There would be illegal bars, some of which were frequented by police officers. In addition, many violent riots and protests to repeal the 18th Amendment took place. This was another form of crime. Enforcing prohibition proved to be extremely difficult. The illegal production and distribution of liquor, otherwise known as bootlegging, became rampant, and the national government did not have the means or the desire to try to enforce every single border, lake, river, and speakeasy in America. In fact, by 1925, in New York City alone, there were anywhere from 30,000 to 100,000 speakeasy clubs. Although the amendment worked at first, people started to illegally manufacture spirits and form mafias. The government proceeded to spend $300 million to enforce this amendment. Finally, the government lost a ton of tax revenue because of this ban. The reason is because most of the business that involved alcohol had to close down. For example, before Prohibition, about 75% of New York's tax revenue came from liquor taxes. However, with the Prohibition in effect, all of that potential revenue was lost. It is said that this was one of the things that led the U.S. into the Great Depression. One of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's campaign promises was to repeal the 18th Amendment. This was a big reason why he won the presidency, since that is what the majority of the country wanted. As president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the Cullen-Harrison Act, an amendment to the Volstead Act in 1933. That same year, it became the 21st Amendment. While the amendment was repealed, the effects were long-lasting. For the next 56 years, the mafia began to get stronger. There were families in the 1930s from all nationalities that made a living by committing crimes. During the 1970s and 1980s, there was a notorious crime boss in New York known as John Gotti. He began his life of crime in 1966 and committed a series of murders. This continued all the way through until 1985, when the FBI finally had enough evidence to bring him to jail. The mafia remained violent and exists to this day. This was a direct effect of the Prohibition.
Most importantly, the ban on alcohol taught America that unpopular laws are hard to enforce, and it was found that without effective regulation, people will find ways around the law if they truly wanted to. That can be deadly. Today, this is being seen as the ban on marijuana. People are producing it illegally, and people are getting sick from the non-regulated substance. Fortunately, states are starting to rescind the ban as a result of wanting to avoid the same problems that existed during the Prohibition era. Americans can see the effect of Prohibition. While it is the only amendment to have ever been overturned, it taught us that amendments can be overturned and Americans have the voice in our country.